in the League of Legends community, in part because esports and League of Legends is still young and filled with young people. We tend to go straight towards the easy way or look for something that's not about building up our knowledge base, that's not about building up our technique, that's not about building up a core or a unit as a team and going from there because we want immediate gratification, but there really isn't one. And because of that, a lot of things like team dynamic tend to be not really researched or they're overlooked. And what you really want is a good team dynamic, a good sense of teamwork, a team that can pull together and do extremely well. And something that I feel like violates this is a big tendency that League of Legends teams tend to have in regions that aren't Korea, which is to build a roster around a single star player. This can go extremely wrong, and it's often something that people emphasize as a good method of building a team, when really I think it's just a crutch. I also think it's something that might be happening with Immortals right now. Immortals is a team that really has no reason to not perform well, and it's probably also unintentional, in part due to the departure of Huni shortly after the announcement of the Dardoch signing. Now, to get to what I'm saying before we dive directly into Immortals, let's talk about examples of teams that have built around star players in the past. Some that have been successful, some that haven't. And by built around, I don't necessarily always mean like, okay, they started from a core player, that yes, we're definitely building this roster around you, so much as these teams eventually gravitated towards that. Probably the most iconic example is SK Telecom T1 with Faker. And when I say that they play around Faker, I don't mean that the rest of the roster is terrible or they just play a supportive role or all the gold gets funneled into Faker. I mean that they put a lot of emphasis on getting that first mid-tier turret almost before any other objective. And a lot of what happens in that team is on the onus of Faker to make more intelligent roams or to use his map advantages better than his opposing mid laner. So I don't mean that it's a resource funneling thing, I just mean it's definitely built around Faker's playstyle and some of SKT's early game disadvantages, because they don't always have the crispest early game, come around making sacrifices for Faker to get a power spike or an advantage in mid or something like this that allows him to exert the kind of pressure that wins SKT their games. Of course, Faker has a long history of kind of accepting this responsibility, of being the player that people look up to, of being the player that people expect to always be the best, so he takes it. And I think that there were times that maybe this didn't necessarily work out, and that may have led to him changing up the roster and him being replaced or rotated in with EasyHoon. Examples that might be more familiar to people in the West include Counterlogic Gaming with Double Lift, right, in the 2014, 2015 era. Those rosters tended to really emphasize him and playing around him, and it was a really familiar thing. And since then, actually, Counterlogic Gaming, you could argue, has had much more success with fewer distinct stars. Other examples that have gone wrong have been Echo Fox, maybe again, not necessarily a roster that was tended to be built around Froggen, but a lot of pressure went into making Froggen the star. I think Alliance had a similar problem as well when they became Elements, things like this, where it's just built around this weird idea of Froggen playing Froggen's game, and then it didn't necessarily pan out. And I think as Echo Fox have changed slightly from game to game, by adding Acadian and things like this, is when they started to look a bit better. It's not just about Froggen's playstyle. Bjergsen, Team Solo Mid, though interestingly enough, when the team actually just became about Bjergsen, like they got rid of the rest of the roster and they decided to rebuild around him, the interesting thing that Team Solo Mid did that worked out was they picked up another star player. So it wasn't just about emphasis on Bjergsen, things like this. Rosters that worked much better though, right, that were playing around an individual player that I haven't mentioned yet include like Edward Gaming with Clearlove and Fnatic with Yellow Star. Edward Gaming with Clearlove is a really interesting case because when the roster was originally built around him in 2013 December-ish, people were really skeptical because it wasn't like Clearlove was necessarily the star jungler, but if you talk to people on the scene, it was much more about his personality and the dynamic that he tends to set within his teams. And eventually, it has gotten really weird since he's become much more of a star player, and it's a lot more obvious that some of the things that the team does are sacrifices to play the way Clearlove wants, and it feels like the team is kind of stagnated because of that, or gotten worse in a lot of ways. So this is a really good example of the dangers and perils of building around a star player, even if it's something that comes over time. Fnatic 2015 with Yellow Star, again, Yellow Star was a core player that they didn't necessarily expect to carry them in games, but he was a stepping stone for them, something that they started with, someone to be a leader or an experienced player, but he wasn't necessarily, like, the eyes weren't on him to carry their games, and I think this is the fundamental difference when you talk about building a roster around a player, is that you don't want to pick a player that is going to be expected to do the work, right? To do all the majority of the work, which is like carry games, lead, all these other things. And I think this is where rosters built around a single player tend to crumble the most. Even when you don't have rosters, like some of the rosters and examples I listed that weren't initially built around a core player, a lot of them start to trend that way, either because of weird roster shifts or roster moves that didn't necessarily pan out, or because the staff isn't strong enough to build an infrastructure or to support a better team environment. And so the strong personality, the strong carry player who just really is domineering and wants to win, tends to just really take over and gain a lot of power and say, no, we're playing around me. And I think this is a fundamental difference between why it doesn't really work in newer scenes like League of Legends Esports, as opposed to some other cases in sports where building around a star player has been more successful because you have a better sense of infrastructure in those cases and maybe some more maturity. Whereas if you don't have a strong staff, you don't have strong management in place, you don't have a strong coach who's going to say, no, we're not playing like that, and be able to make a convincing case for why not, or have the other players in place to make it possible to not play like that, or to set up a more compelling dynamic, that's when you really get into trouble with having a clearly defined star player that you're playing around or that the team is built around. This is much more likely to happen in regions that are not Korea. It's not because Koreans are just better. It's because I feel like, again, infrastructurally, we don't have the base, either because of solo queue, cultural values, or staff resources to really develop players to the extent that a lot of Korean teams have been able to do. You see a lot of instances where teams will just bench problematic players. I mentioned the Faker example. I'm not necessarily saying Faker is problematic. This is just a theory that was put forth, is that there was a little bit difference between when Faker played and when he didn't. For example, the Vici Gaming manager said that one thing that EasyHoon has said is when EasyHoon played, there was more of a collective sense on SKT of communication in terms of who was shot calling at what time, and it was much more of a team collective kind of communication structure as opposed to when Faker was playing. But this is actually really a luxury that Western teams and Chinese teams don't necessarily always have, because they can't constantly fill those shoes, right? And I actually don't think it's necessarily something we should aim to do as a solution to a problematic player every time, rather than just get better at fostering this player, at giving these players these opportunities to succeed, at making teams feel more holistic, and taking responsibility as staff members and things of that nature for when things go wrong, as opposed to putting it on like these younger players who are in the spotlight, who have reputations for being toxic or something like this. So I think that when these sorts of things happen, when we feel like we have to bench our best talent and we don't have the reserves to replace them, that's failings on staff and infrastructure. That's not necessarily the player's fault. Here's why I feel like this might be something that is happening on Immortals, or something that might be a problem with Immortals. right off the bat in the announcement that Immortals made when they signed Dardoch is they let us know that as opposed to the other contracts that they listed, Dardoch was a special player that they chose to sign for 3 years. They said that a 3-year contract is rare, that these types of situations don't happen frequently, that there's something special in Dardoch that they want to continue to develop. When Dardoch signed with Immortals, okay, in the announcement video that they put out, he said that he felt like he could go to this team because it was an environment where he expected to have other experienced LCS players, and he didn't necessarily have the pressure to lead, but he could if he wanted to. And this is, for me, the key issue here. When you take a star player and you put him on a team and the team starts to go sour, is that some of these players that are really driven, really want to win and things like this, they will feel pressure to lead if there isn't that supportive leadership infrastructure already in place. In the case of Immortals, I think that because they were put on the back foot when Huni went to SK Telecom, you do end up in a situation where the team is built around Dardoch. Pobelter and Cody Sun only have 2-year contracts each. Then they didn't necessarily explicitly state the lengths of the contracts for Flame and Ola, but you get this idea that they want Dardoch to be their core player, right? They want him to be the strength that leads the team in the future. Not necessarily explicitly lead, because that's what he said, he didn't necessarily want the pressure to do so, but it feels like it's kind of happening. When you watch Immortals' games, there feels like there's a distinct division between the top and bottom half of the map. Dardoch is frequently on the top half, invading the jungle and taking control there because of the strength of Flame as a laner. In the bottom, there are all sorts of issues with Kode-san and Ola that is either portrays a misunderstanding of where the jungle should be on the map. For example, in the game against FlyQuest, there was an instance where Dardoch chases Moon out of the topside red area jungle, and either the bottom lane assumed that Moon backed, or there just wasn't communication of this factor because they went aggressive shortly after and Moon showed up. When it was clear, based on the pathing, that Moon was chased into his blue buff area, the jungle. And it's possible that they assumed that he had backed because wolves didn't spawn immediately when he went in there. But the principle remains the same, that there was just a very large disconnect. There also seems to be an issue with teleports and teleport timing going into the bottom lane. There was this really weird game against Phoenix 1 where for most of the game, Dardoch and Flame were undefeated in terms of deaths. They hadn't died, and then the bottom lane and the mid lane were just kind of bleeding all over the place. And it's a give and take for sure, because these players are not necessarily controlling their lane effectively, but there's very little jungle presence as well, or mid lane presence when things go wrong. And it just feels like the map is split really weirdly, and that shouldn't necessarily happen unless there's something that's going wrong in the environment or something that's going wrong in terms of leadership within the organization or leadership within the team. And it feels a lot like there's added pressure on the top half of the map, and that immediately is going to go to Dardoch, who has felt pressure to lead in the past on Team Liquid, according to the documentary, according to a lot of the things that he's said himself. And Flame doesn't necessarily speak the best English, and he has also had a history of kind of this sort of behavior where it looks like he feels really pressured to carry, so he just tunnel visions on his lane. And this is why I bring up this concept of building a roster or playing around a star player. It takes a very rare individual in circumstances like the Immortals find themselves in currently to not feel a great deal of pressure to carry, to feel like the team is built around them. Like, I feel like that has to be the sort of pressure, is that Immortals have singled you out as a special individual worthy of a 3-year contract. Huni has departed. There isn't necessarily a lot of experience on the team in terms of shot calling from players like Dardoch or Cody Sun, and then there is a big language barrier with Ola and Flame, and Ola doesn't necessarily display the sense of fundamentals or roaming or map control that suggests that he necessarily knows what to do either. Flame's history has been very, very lane focused when he does play, and I made a separate video about this earlier, so a lot of the onus is still going back to Dardoch. This is something that I really want to caution against teams doing is necessarily singling out the star player as someone that you tell is special, someone that you tell has the onus to be a star that you really want to cultivate, because there has to be a moment where one of those types of players has a bad game and someone else demonstrates they can take the reins for the team to gel, for the team to really have a sense of unity. Because if it just becomes about one player, that's definitely a recipe for disaster. I'm not necessarily saying that this is definitely what's happening with Immortals, but it's set up in such a way that it easily could if it isn't already. Dardoch has been singled out by staff in public. Fans are singling out Dardoch and potentially Flame. There's definitely a gap between, I think, what Dardoch expected of the roster and what has happened, just visibly what you can see on screen. And so this, for me, is the risk of saying, okay, we're going to, first of all, cultivate and pick a player who's really strong, who's a star, and we're going to build the roster around them. Because when you get to that position, there's very little wiggle room, and it just becomes really obvious for everyone involved. So I think that this, to me, is a shortcut, because instead of establishing the environment, instead of establishing really, really strong foundation for staff and team play, you're saying, okay, all this other stuff that I just listed, that this is your fault. This is your job. And maybe they don't say that, but it feels like it most likely. And that's why I think this is a shortcut people should avoid when they build rosters, and you really need to know what you're doing if you're looking at a star player to pick up, and make sure that this isn't necessarily the first piece you grab or a piece that you single out when you do grab it.